On June 24, 1980, Fred Astaire married Robin Smith in a private ceremony at his Beverly Hills home. He was 81 years old. She was 35, a celebrated jockey whose life had been built around racetracks rather than Hollywood sound stages. Astaire's son came to the wedding with his wife. His daughter, Ava, did not. Neither did Adele, the sister who had known Fred longer than almost anyone alive. The ceremony was quiet, but the division it revealed was not. To the public, Fred Astaire had spent decades appearing perfectly controlled. Every movement rehearsed, every emotion contained, every private difficulty kept safely outside the frame. Then, near the end of his life, he made one of his most personal decisions without securing the approval of the people closest to him. The question is not simply why an 81-year-old Hollywood legend married a woman 45 years younger. It is why Fred Astaire was willing to divide his family for a relationship he believed the rest of the world could never fully understand. Fred Astaire spent most of his professional life telling people he was terrible, not in the way that performers fish for compliments, waiting for someone to say, "No, you were magnificent." He said it with a specific, almost clinical insistence that made the people around him uncomfortable, because it was clearly not performance. He would watch footage of himself and grimace. He said he never watched his own films if he could avoid it, and when he was forced to, he saw only the mistakes. He told interviewers he was not a great dancer. He told friends he didn't understand why people came to see him. He said more than once that he never once finished a take believing he had gotten it right. This was a man who made 31 musical films, who won an honorary Academy Award, who appeared on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest male stars in the history of American cinema at number 5, behind only Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant, James Stewart, and Marlon Brando, whose work with Ginger Rogers across 10 films between 1933 and 1949 defined what American popular entertainment looked and felt like for 2 decades. A man who, at the age of 50, taught himself to play the drums well enough to perform with jazz musicians because he felt he had more to learn. The same man who said publicly that he was dissatisfied with every dance he had ever put on film. There are 2 ways to read this. One is that it was a kind of modesty, the performance of humility that certain kinds of performers use as a shield against ego, because the ego underneath is so enormous that it needs constant puncturing to stay manageable. The other is that it was true, that Fred Astaire genuinely did not experience his own talent the way the rest of the world experienced it. That there was a gap between what he saw when he looked in the mirror and what 400 million people saw when they looked at the screen. And, if that second reading is closer to correct, it explains something about why he built his life the way he did, with compartments, with distances, with a series of carefully maintained partitions between what he showed people and what he kept. He was born Frederick Austerlitz in Omaha, Nebraska, on May 10, 1899. His father, Frederick Austerlitz Sr., had come from Austria. His mother, Johanna, was a Midwesterner who had recognized something in her children early and decided to act on it with a ferocity that was unusual even by the standards of the era. By the time Fred was 4 years old, she had decided that he and his sister Adele were going to be performers. She moved the family to New York when Fred was 7 to pursue it. His father stayed in Omaha. What followed was the particular kind of childhood that produces either extraordinary artists or deeply damaged adults, and sometimes both at once. Fred and Adele were enrolled in dance school in New York, then sent to Keyport, New Jersey, to study under a teacher named Claude Alvienne. They performed in vaudeville. They toured. They worked. Adele was, in those early years, the one everyone noticed. She was magnetic in the way performers who seem born to the stage are magnetic. Effortless, radiant, the kind of presence that made audiences lean forward before she'd done anything. Fred was the technical one. Fred worked. Fred was the one who stayed after class to run it again, who went home and practiced what he'd already practiced, who believed, even as a child, that whatever he could do was not yet sufficient. By the time they were teenagers, the Astaires were a professional act. By the time they reached Broadway in the early 1920s, they were stars. And Adele, throughout this period, was still the one the critics reached for adjectives to describe. Fred was the good one, the excellent one, the meticulous one, the one you watched with admiration. Adele was the one you watched with love. This division, subtle as it was, shaped him. Not bitterly, Fred adored Adele, genuinely, without complexity or competition. But it installed in him a belief that ran so deep it became invisible, that the thing he did was fundamentally technical, that the warmth, the ease, the quality that made people feel something, that was not his. That could be taken away, that he had to earn over and over with preparation. Adele retired from performing in 1932, when she married Lord Charles Cavendish and moved to Ireland. Fred was 33 years old and suddenly alone in the act that had defined his entire professional life. What happened next is the part of the story that gets told as triumph. And it was. But inside the triumph, if you look at the sequence of events, is something more complicated. He went to Hollywood. He was 33, a stage dancer in a world still learning what film could do with the human body in motion. His screen test at RKO produced a memo that has since become famous, a piece of Hollywood brutality so perfectly concise that it's almost beautiful in its wrongness. Can't act, slightly bald, can dance a little. He framed that memo and kept it on the wall of his office. He talked about it in interviews. He was charmed by it, or performed being charmed by it, because the alternative, that it had wounded him in some way that didn't heal, was not something he would ever say out loud. He made Flying Down to Rio in 1933. He was not the lead. He was supporting Dolores Del Rio and Jean Raymond, but the studio put him in a dance sequence with a young actress named Ginger Rogers, and the audience's reaction to that sequence was sharp enough that everyone in the building understood something had happened. They were paired again and again. By 1935, with Top Hat, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers were among the most bankable performers in American cinema. The partnership with Rogers is the thing that gets discussed most, partly because it produced the films, and partly because there was something about the combination that was genuinely greater than its parts. Rogers gave his technique a target. She was not the most technically accomplished dancer he ever worked with. He would say later that in pure technical terms, Eleanor Powell could do things Rogers couldn't. But she gave the dancing a reason. She was the audience standing up there with him. You watched her face and you understood what you were supposed to feel. Astaire understood this. He was scrupulous about giving Rogers credit, publicly and consistently, over a span of decades when he could have done otherwise. He said famously that she gave him sex appeal and he gave her class. What's less often noted is how carefully he said it. Not that she gave him warmth or humanity, but something more specific and more narrow. Sex appeal. The implication, just visible at the edge of the statement, is that the warmth was his only because she created it. He married Phyllis Livingston Potter in 1933, the same year he made Flying Down to Rio, the same year the partnership with Rogers began. Phyllis was not from the entertainment world. She was from old Boston money, the kind of background that regarded show business as something one tolerated in others but would not choose. She became, by all accounts, the person Fred Astaire trusted most in the world, the anchor, the private person who stood behind everything public. They had 3 children. They were married for 21 years. Phyllis Astaire died of lung cancer on September 13, 1954. She was 46 years old. Fred was 55. People who knew him in the years that followed talked about the change in terms that made the word shattered seem insufficient. He had built his life around 2 constants: the work, which he controlled, and Phyllis, who understood him without asking to understand him. One of those was gone. He went on making films. He made Funny Face in 1957 with Audrey Hepburn. He made Silk Stockings that same year with Sid Charisse. He made television specials. He accepted awards. He worked. But people who saw him at home said the house felt like a different kind of place after Phyllis died, and that Fred moved through it like a man performing domesticity in a room where the audience had gone. He did not remarry. For 25 years, he did not remarry. Instead, he developed a serious interest in horse racing. He studied it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he studied, which was total. He learned the biology, the breeding, the training methods. He visited tracks. He owned horses. And through the world of horse racing in the early 1970s, he encountered Robin Smith. Smith was, by any measure, a remarkable person to encounter. Born in 1942, which made her 43 years younger than Astaire, she had arrived in professional horse racing through a path that no one had cleared for her, because no one had cleared it for anyone like her. She was a woman in a profession that regarded women jockeys as something between a novelty and a problem. She was not regarded as a novelty. She was regarded, once people paid attention, as one of the best tactical riders in the sport. She won at Aqueduct. She won at Santa Anita. She rode with a stillness in the saddle that trainers noticed and couldn't quite account for. She was, in the world she had chosen, a person who moved against resistance so consistently that the resistance had become invisible to her. Astaire began attending the races at which she rode. He sought introductions. He found reasons to be in the places where she was. This was, for a man who had spent 6 decades being visibly Fred Astaire, a form of behavior that required a particular kind of commitment to invisibility. He was good at it. The people who noticed something between them before the marriage was announced were very few. His daughter Ava said later that she had not known. His son, Fred Jr., said later that he had not known either. There is a version of this that reads as purely romantic. The old man who fell in love, who found, at the end of his life, something he hadn't expected. And that version is probably correct, or at least not incorrect. But there is also something else in it, something that connects back to the man who said he hated watching himself on screen, who said he never once finished a take believing it was good, who built a life around mastery, and then said consistently, publicly, that the mastery had never been quite enough. He had always kept things separate, his work from his private life, his public performance from his private belief about the quality of that performance, his professional relationships from his personal ones. The marriage to Robin Smith was, in one sense, a continuation of the same instinct, to hold something entirely private, in a life that had been almost entirely public, to have one corner of experience that belonged to no one else, that required no performance, that existed outside the gaze that had followed him since he was 7 years old. They were married in June of 1980. The ceremony was small. The announcement came afterward, from a publicist's statement, not from Astaire himself. His children learned from the statement. Some of his oldest colleagues learned from newspapers. The reaction was, in some quarters, unkind. The 43-year age gap produced the predictable commentary, most of it directed at Smith, the implication being that her motives required more examination than his. This kind of analysis overlooked several things. It overlooked that Astaire, by the accounts of everyone who knew him in this period, was visibly happier than he had been in years. It overlooked that Smith, who had built her reputation entirely independently, had little obvious interest in managing someone else's legacy. It overlooked that Astaire himself, who was 80 years old and still possessed of his faculties and opinions, had made a choice and knew what it was. He continued to work intermittently in these years. He had reinvented himself in the 1970s as a dramatic actor, a move that surprised people who had not been paying close attention but shouldn't have surprised anyone who had. He was nominated for an Academy Award for his supporting role in The Towering Inferno in 1974. He accepted the Kennedy Center honor in 1978. He gave interviews in which he remained to the end dismissive of his own talent and meticulous about giving credit to the people around him. Robin Smith Astaire was with him when he died on June 22, 1987, at the age of 88 from pneumonia. He had been briefly hospitalized and had initially seemed to be recovering. He did not recover. He died in the hospital in Los Angeles, in her presence. His estate passed largely to her. His children contested portions of this in court, a legal conflict that was settled privately. The details of what was said, what was argued, what the children felt about the years in which their father had kept this marriage from them. These are not matters of public record in any useful sense. What is a matter of record is that the man they buried had spent the last 7 years of his life in a marriage most of them had not known was happening until it had already happened. The biographical question this raises is not psychological in the simple sense. It is not about what Astaire feared or what he wanted to hide or what he thought his children would say. These are guesses that even the people closest to him couldn't answer with confidence. The question is more structural. How does a person who had been observed professionally, almost without interruption for 60 years, manage to conduct an entire private life without the observation landing? Part of the answer is that he was extraordinarily disciplined. The discipline that made him the dancer he was, the hours of preparation, the refusal to accept a version of something that was almost right, the ability to hold intention over a sustained period without flagging, extended into every area of his life. He was not careless about anything. He did not do things by accident. If he kept the marriage private, it was because he had decided to keep it private, and he executed that decision with the same precision he brought to a complicated tap sequence. Part of the answer is also that he had spent 60 years showing people what he wanted them to see. He was not ungenerous with the public. He gave interviews, he appeared on television, he accepted honors with what looked like genuine, if slightly bemused, pleasure. But within that openness, there were lines. There were things he did not discuss, questions he deflected with such practiced ease that interviewers often didn't notice the deflection was happening. His grief after Phyllis died, for instance. The depth of it was visible to people who knew him well. To the press, he was stoic and private, which everyone accepted as appropriate, and which also happened to be exactly what he wanted. The discomfort he expressed about his own performances is the thing that stays with you. Not because it was false, by all accounts, it was entirely genuine, but because of what it means alongside the rest of it. Here was a man who controlled, with extraordinary care, what the world was allowed to see of him, who shaped his own image with a craftsman's precision. And yet the one thing he could not shape, the one thing that kept escaping the frame, was his own opinion of what he'd made. He could control what people saw of his personal life. He could not make himself believe that what they saw when he danced was real. There is something almost unbearable about this, if you sit with it long enough. The greatest dancer of the 20th century, and by the consensus of everyone from Rudolf Nureyev to Mikhail Baryshnikov, who said Astaire was the most interesting dancer he had ever watched. The word greatest is not an overstatement. Believed that what he had done was insufficient. Not in a performative way. In the private way that doesn't look for reassurance because reassurance doesn't touch it. The marriage to Robin Smith, hidden for 7 years from the people closest to him, sits alongside this not as a contradiction, but as a continuation. He had learned very early that the thing you show people and the thing you are not the same. And he had organized his life around that knowledge. His talent was public property. His grief was his own. His love, late in his life, was his own as well. He died, by the accounts of people who were there peacefully, in the presence of the woman he had married in secret and loved for a decade. His children were not at the hospital when it happened. Whether this was by chance or by arrangement or simply by the speed at which things moved at the end is not recorded. On the day of his death, the tributes began immediately. They used words like genius and legend and incomparable. They showed clips of him moving across a screen the way no one before or after has moved across a screen. They talked about the films, the choreography, the partnership with Rogers, the discipline, the innovation. They did not, for the most part, talk about the marriage, except in the briefest terms. The story they told was the story he had spent 60 years helping to shape, the work, the precision, the inexplicable thing that happened when the music started and he began to move. What they couldn't fit into the tributes is the image of a man standing in a darkened screening room, watching his own footage and seeing only the mistakes, or the image of a man in his 70s, famous for 70 years, finding a reason to be at a racetrack on a Tuesday afternoon. Or the image of a man signing a marriage certificate and telling almost no one, not because he was ashamed, but because it was his, and he intended to keep it that way. Robin Smith Astaire did not give many interviews in the years after his death. She kept the house. She kept, as best she could, the privacy he had wanted. When she spoke about him, she spoke the way people speak about someone whose company they genuinely miss, without the practiced cadences of public grief, without performance. She missed him. That much was clear. The dance films are still there. Every few years, someone writes about Astaire and Rogers and uses the word timeless and means it, because the thing they made together genuinely does not age in the way that most things from the 1930s age. You can watch Cheek to Cheek from Top Hat, and you are watching something choreographed and filmed and edited with mathematical precision over weeks of rehearsal. And you are also watching something that looks like it just happened, like no one planned it. Like two people simply decided to move, and the music was already there. The craft is invisible. The intention is invisible. What remains is the thing itself. He would not have agreed that he got it right. He would have told you, specifically, which moment in which take was wrong. He would have been polite about it, and serious, and he would not have been persuaded. Somewhere in there, in the gap between what everyone else saw and what he saw, is the truth of a man who kept more things to himself than anyone knew. His private suffering, his private love, his private assessment of his own work, which no amount of tributes or Nureyev's admiration ever quite touched. The certificate from 1980 is filed in Los Angeles County. It says what it says. A man who was famous for showing people everything, and who had in fact spent 60 years showing them almost nothing of the real thing, signing his name beside the name of a woman who loved him, in a room where, for once, no one was watching.